I'm Stephen Riley, which I may not have said before. I'm the founding director of Remuseum. Remuseum is a project, an independent project that exists to support innovation and help museums be more effective at serving their missions. Remuseum was inspired and is funded by David Booth, an entrepreneur, philanthropist, and art collector based in Austin, Texas, inspired by conversations he was having with Alice Walton in Bentonville. As a result, Remuseum sits as an independent project within Crystal Bridges Museum of American Art, where I work very closely with Executive Director Rod Bigelow and his colleagues, and increasingly in partnership with Art Bridges Foundation in Bentonville and its CEO, Ann Craybill. Remuseum has also received additional support and funding from Darren Walker and the Ford Foundation. So how does Remuseum do this work of supporting innovation and museum effectiveness at serving their missions? We do it in two ways. The first is through research, through our research partners, IO, an affiliate of Indiana University's Center for Cultural Affairs, and advised by a task force of leaders from museums, philanthropy, and the world of social impact. We're developing a methodology that will evaluate individual museums' effectiveness at serving their missions. If you haven't, you can check out on our website. You should see our first report, which documents the radical and important shift in American Art Museum mission statements from being centered around objects to being centered around the public, and the resulting transparency that is evolving in terms of information that museums are sharing with the public. We're now engaged in a broader research project that will present an evaluation of individual museums and their effectiveness at serving their missions. And we love all museums to provide data through our data portal at remuseum.org that helps us confirm and contextualize the research that we're gathering publicly. Remuseum also exists to support innovation and examples of innovation in the field. Our research will call attention to the ones who are showing us ways forward. Remuseum organizes gatherings and convenings of leaders who are exploring new initiatives in museum operations. And now we're launching with our first webinar, and we hope to do more in the future. So please share some ideas you would like to see us address with webinars in the future. Right now, why are we addressing fundraising, and why now? After all, museums in America have always had expenses that outpace their revenues, and yet somehow they've survived. But museums today are facing a particular set of financial challenges that can really only be addressed by fundraising. Right now, visitation, and I'm speaking in general terms, for the average American museum remains 20 to 30% below pre-COVID levels. At the same time, expenses are up. And for many American museums, they're also up 20 to 30% because of inflation, rising exhibition costs, utilities, and from compensation. Both the desire and the demand to compensate museum staff members more equitably has led to an increase in that expense. And third, and at the same time, the federal funding of the arts and cultural organizations from 2020 to 2022 during COVID, which represent the largest period of federal grant making in the arts any of us will ever see in our lifetimes, likely, has most of that cash, which went to fund museum operations and staff salaries, has been spent. So what to do? What to do right now when museums need cash and need it now? Well, it turns out, as I learned when I was a museum director, that the most reliable way to raise revenue in the short term, and the way to do it that generates the highest margins, meaning that the expense is overcome by a return that can help fund programs and salaries and other increased expenses, is from contributed revenue, and in particular from major gift and major donor fundraising. And as I also learned when I was a museum director, there is a science to this work. Yet many museums, museum leaders, trustees, and others seem to feel some degree of hesitancy and uncertainty about treating this work like a business would. At a gathering of museum leaders I hosted in January, some of the directors of America's largest museums admitted to a lack of confidence in knowing how much they should be investing in major gift fundraising and what kind of returns they could be generating from it. So that gave me the realization that it was time to share some best practices from people who know how to practice the art and science of museum fundraising. My friend KP Trueblood, who's director and COO of the Brooklyn Art Museum, led me to CCS Fundraising, and I'm happy to introduce three people from CCS today. Managing directors Barry Cass, Miriam Droller, and Caroline Rosen have deep experience in helping museums structure their fundraising operations and overseeing and managing large-scale campaigns. And they bring to that experience not just work with arts and cultural institutions, but as well with higher ed and healthcare institutions. And they're going to bring all that today and help us all understand how to help American art museums raise more money and thrive. Thank you for joining us. Thanks. And now it's time for Barry, Miriam, and Caroline to take it away.
Thanks so much, Stephen. We are just absolutely thrilled to be with you and partnering with Remuseum to share more about fundraising best practices and strategies. We are so cognizant that the demands on contributed revenue continue to increase for all of you. And we hope that today we share some insights, context, and strategies for consideration that will help you in meeting some of the demands on your activities. So today we just want to cover briefly, introduce ourselves, share a little bit about CCS. We want to give an overview of the current philanthropic landscape. How do we use the opportunities that are out there to really inform our work and focus our efforts? We want to think about other sectors. What have we learned from their approaches, and what can we bring to bear on our work in the museum space? How should we think about investing in fundraising at museums? Why it's so important? What is the return on the investment? And how can we make that case to our leadership? And of course, we do want to leave some time for question and answers. We'll be monitoring the chat throughout, so please go ahead and share those questions. So as Stephen said, I am delighted to be joined by my illustrious colleagues, Barry and Caroline. Despite our youthful visages, collectively, we have about 40 years of fundraising experience, and we bring significant experience in the museum world with the Brooklyn Museum, as well as many others. And we all really thrive on helping organizations realize their goals and visions for what it means to be a museum now and in the future. Go to the next slide. Just a little bit about CCS. We've been at this for 75 years. And as Stephen mentioned, we work across all sectors of American philanthropy, which really affords us a true understanding of the evolving philanthropic landscape. We are able to apply learnings and best practices across all sectors. And we do have this deep experience in the arts and culture space, both across the country and increasingly internationally as well. All of our work really focuses on expanding contributed revenue during inflection points or times of transformation, whether that's through an assessment of opportunities in infrastructure, dedicated campaign planning and execution, and even interim staffing and leadership coaching. 90% of our partnerships are clients who come back to us at their next phase of opportunity or refer us to others, for which we are most grateful. Just a couple of examples of some of our work, but really a breadth across the sector, across the country, and really differences in terms of size of organizations, focus, and mission. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Caroline to talk a little bit about the landscape.
Thanks, Miriam. Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. As Miriam said, we want to start off this webinar by providing a bit of background on the current philanthropic landscape, both broadly and then specifically as it relates to museums. Every year, Giving USA produces a report on philanthropy from the prior year. So in June of 2023, they released the report on 2022. The 2024 report covering last year, so 23, is actually going to be released over the next couple of weeks. So this information that you see here will soon be updated. But looking at 2022, philanthropic contributions totaled nearly $500 billion. This was a slight decline from the prior year, so from 2021, but that's in large part due to the high inflation rates. While there was a slight decline, many sectors did see an increase in giving. For example, international affairs and foundations saw increases that outpaced that high inflation rate. The big takeaway from this chart is the importance of individuals in driving philanthropy in the US. Individuals also increasingly use foundations, bequests, and their own corporate giving programs to really make their gifts. So they have a outsized influence beyond just that 64% of individuals. Corporate giving at the bottom is a really small portion of the overall giving. So where does arts and culture fall specifically within this? So arts and culture actually receives a relatively small portion of the overall philanthropic giving pie at about 5% or $25 billion. That said, the overarching trend continues to be increased giving towards arts and culture, as with other sectors. So most sectors continue to exceed pre-pandemic levels, even when adjusted for inflation. And every sector has increased in giving since 2017. So over the past 5 years, there's definitely been a continued increase. Which is why it's really important to think about philanthropy in the historical context. So what this chart shows is that over the past 40 years, philanthropy remains resilient, even in times of crisis and moments of economic uncertainty. COVID-19 led to a significant jump up. You can see that in 2020 as donors really met the moment, and 2020 and 2021 are the two best years of giving on record when adjusted for inflation. But the key point here is that overall, philanthropy really does continue to grow and is a really powerful investment that an organization can make. Looking ahead, so I mentioned that the new information for 2023 will be released soon. We also expect giving in 2024 and 2025 to continue to grow. CCS has found that about 64% of arts and culture organizations also expect their major and mid-level gifts and annual appeals to increase in 2024. So it's looking optimistic over the next couple of years. Also grounding us in what we expect this year and over the next couple of years is that recent world events and geopolitics, we would expect that to impact this year's giving. So for example, in 2022, we saw an increase in international giving following Russia's invasion of Ukraine. And we'd expect recent political events to also influence giving. However, 2024 is an election year. You may think that in an election year with donors giving more to presidential and federal candidates, that they would give less to charity, but data actually shows that those who are giving to those presidential and federal candidates tend to increase their overall donations to charity as well. So even in an election year, philanthropy is a really powerful investment and remains very consistent. One other thing to note at the broader level before we dive into specifically museums is that while the total number of donors continues to decrease, and in fact, 2022 saw a 10% decrease in total donors, it is staying consistent because we are seeing wealthier donors play an even bigger role in charitable giving. So this is allowing the changes to be more moderate, even in difficult environments. So the decline in gifts among donors tends to be at the lower levels rather than those larger gift levels. It does raise the point that donor retention continues to be identified by institutions as a key challenge that they are facing. And given the importance of individual gifts in the overall philanthropy, we know how important it is to retain donors. That said, arts and culture organizations we've found generally do better than other organizations when it comes to donor acquisition and retention. So that's definitely a positive note. Looking specifically at museums. So Stephen touched on this in his introduction, but the financial recovery from COVID definitely remains a key issue. Recovery has not been consistent across museums. So the AAM found that it's split roughly in thirds in terms of whether organizations are seeing their net operating performance as less than it was in 2019, the same as it was in 2019, or greater than. And as Stephen mentioned, the museum field really continues to face financial strains. About half of museums indicated that in the prior year, they either lost revenue or had to make difficult decisions on personnel, programs, other expenditures, or all of the above, or they've had to dip into their endowments in order to weather those unforeseen circumstances, which is another reason, we'll talk about this in a bit, but that endowments can be really powerful for museums. Looking ahead, though, like a lot of the other projections, Museums project that their bottom line will increase this year as compared to 2022 by a median of about 10%. As Stephen also mentioned, a key issue remains attendance. The vast majority of museums have not yet recovered to pre-pandemic attendance levels. 2/3 of museums continue to experience reduced attendance. And as Stephen said, of those experiencing reduced attendance, about 70% of what they had previously. So this is really important because it changes the amount of earned revenue that a museum can have and can rely on. It makes it very difficult to rely on some of these attendance numbers, which is why contributed revenue and donations becomes a really important part of a revenue stream. So what do the revenue streams look like at museums? The 4 key areas of revenue are listed here. We're going to focus on contributed revenue, which is primarily annual gifts, fundraising campaigns, donations, all of that would really come from donors. It's really essential to the health of a museum. And as I said at the beginning, it's really essential. It's really connected to individuals in philanthropy. We're going to focus primarily on the contributed revenue today, as it can really help increase a museum's financial health and stability. That said, it's really important to take a really strategic and intentional approach to investment in contributed revenue. I will say, I mentioned endowments earlier. Here it is worth noting that we are seeing museums do campaigns and focus on increasing their endowments. During the pandemic, museums suddenly lost a significant portion of their earned revenue, which meant that many museums were relying on federal support to stay open. Having a strong endowment can ensure the longevity of an institution. And so we're seeing museums increasingly focus on really growing their endowments to have those guaranteed financial support through permanent funds. And then finally, one last slide before we move on to the rest of the presentation is that museums are also encountering staffing challenges. This really reflects the broader transforming landscape of American workplaces, but many museums are struggling to fill open positions, making changes when it comes to compensation and working conditions, and trying to restaff after the pandemic. For museums who have open positions, 60% have reported they're having difficulty filling those positions, which is important in terms of building the contributed revenue. And we're seeing a drop in full-time employees. So over the past 4 years since pre-pandemic in 2019, the average number of full-time employees at a museum has dropped by about 10%. This is general. It's different across different regions. Some regions are seeing increases and some are seeing more dramatic decreases, but generally we are seeing this trend. And with salary, compensation and working conditions are really a primary concern at museums right now. 84% of museums surveyed by the AAM have increased the hourly rate of the lowest paid employees since 2019, or they are planning to do so in the next year. And about 1/3 have made changes to the benefits packages. So this is really in a state of flux right now and a focus of all museums. And then finally, the unionization of employees. These staffing challenges really correspond with an uptick in recent unionizations and union contracts. More than 30 museums across the US are either in the process of forming a union or have recently ratified their first union contracts, which includes museums of all sizes and across all regions. And these contracts generally contain significant salary increases, minimum pay rates, provisions for topics like healthcare benefits, layoff protections, and safety measures. So they're really impacting a museum's ability to staff. That's a little bit of background on the philanthropic landscape. Given this landscape, I'm going to turn it over to Barry to talk about what we can really learn from other sectors that invest in contributed revenue and fundraising.
Great, thanks so much. So this section is we're going to kind of pull the lens out a little bit and not focus necessarily directly on arts and culture, but take a look at what kind of best practices are and take a look at a sector, specifically healthcare, where we've seen a significant investment in fundraising and what the results in ROI of that, just so we can then take some learnings from that and apply it to the arts and culture sector. So if we go to the next slide, came out of a report that CCS published last year. It was about 600 organizations. And to Caroline's point that she just made, we've seen a lot of kind of investing in the salaries of the fundraising staff. And here you can look at organizations with the revenue growth greater than 10% over the year, which is obviously, we know, a very significant increase in revenue, did decide to pay their staff, their fundraising staff, by 10% or more, or that bigger chunk, that yellow chunk, 1 to 9%. So we are seeing kind of in the near term that supporting and increasing the salaries of your fundraising staff does have a significant impact in terms of what the institutions and organizations bring in philanthropic revenue. If we jump to the next slide, a few more things to think about. It's not necessarily just having the staff and then paying them a significant salary, market salary. It's also, what do we have them focusing on? So here on the left-hand side, this optimal staff ratio is something that we see a lot. And when we go into an organization, it's one of our first kind of analysis points. So how many people do you have doing frontline fundraising? And then how many people are kind of in the office supporting that fundraising? And roughly the sweet spot that we see, and arts and culture tends to be at the 1 to 3 and not the 1 to 5. But is this kind of, for every frontline fundraiser, you have 3 or 5 back office people. And what we mean by back office people are who is scheduling. It could be as easy as scheduling. Who's scheduling meetings? We all know that scheduling a meeting can be an absolute nightmare. So if you're trying to get on someone's calendar, do you have assistance with that? Do you have someone doing your prospect research? Or are you the frontline fundraiser kind of in your office researching a prospect until you can go out and talk to them? Do you have a operations or data team that is churning through the membership lists, the visitor lists, whatever kind of annual fund lists that you have, and then providing some analysis and pushing out new prospective donors to your frontline fundraisers? All of these functions are incredibly important when you want your frontline fundraisers to be successful, and you want them to be doing what they're great at doing, which is being out and about and cultivating and stewarding your top donors or your potential donors. On the right, we get into kind of retention. Oh, I'm sorry. Yeah, thank you. We get into retention, and everyone on this call likely knows that it's hard to retain development staff. It's hard to find them initially. It's hard to retain them. All of the things that we're talking about here is part of that retention. Is how are they supported? How are they provided with their salary? Is it all kind of up to par? And at the end of the day, you're really looking at people who stay in these positions longer, are their ability to bring in higher level gifts. It increases exponentially sort of as they go in through their time here. So at the time at the organization. So the Chronicle of Philanthropy found that on average, 4 years for a major gift fundraiser to sort of mature into their role and their pipeline. And then when you go beyond those 4 years, it's a significant increase in the average dollars raised by that fundraiser. So kind of providing folks with livable salaries, support is obviously very helpful in retaining them.
Barry, this is, Stephen, can I just, we had one question, and then I thought maybe just a clarification about this point, because you've got the ratio on the left and the productivity on the right. Is the productivity measured by the frontline person, or is it by the whole, each member of the team?
This chart, the productivity is the frontline person.
Okay.
Thank you for the question.
And then the other one is that Rod Bigelow from Crystal Bridges asked, is the focus, I guess comparing the slide before to this one, is the return generated more by, or the focus more on raising pay by role, or investing more in all roles?
I think it's a combination of both. I think many organizations have found in a competitive hiring environment that increasing compensation as a retention and a recruitment strategy was really key, but also overall investment in fundraising really to optimize that revenue lever when, for example, attendance was not the same type of lever in this in post-pandemic.
Great, thank you. And I guess an example for me, having run a museum, is that I hadn't really thought about the ratios as this scientific. And I think an example is that, well, you need to pay that frontline person well, but you also need to make sure they're most effective by paying 3 people well behind each of them, right? And that's an example of, I think a lot of museums may not think about that holistic investment that's required to maximize the return.
For sure. And Rod, and also just to add to this, we've worked with a museum where it was very, very top heavy in terms of salaries. And the kind of the people that were working in the back office did not have the salary increases that the kind of the senior level team did. And it was constant churn, which for sure impacts, you're bringing someone up to speed. I mean, we all know how difficult it can be to get someone to create a research profile that's exactly spot on. So I've seen that happen also. So to kind of answer your questions and reiterating what Miriam had said, it's really taking a look at the whole team in a holistic perspective and making sure that the salaries are market. Okay. We can go to the next slide. So we wanted to take a quick look at some of our healthcare organizations. So this is just a kind of quick chart to show you how a lot of our healthcare clients look at how their investments, like what is the productivity of their investments that they're making into fundraising, into their advancement structures. So on the left side, you see kind of, okay, so our fundraising expenses range from 500 all the way to 15 million. This is not going to be in an arts and culture necessarily, but then we move into what is the ROI on that? And you can see that you're up to on an average of about $5, which is pretty incredible when you can show that to kind of any business person or board member. And I think they would be thrilled with that. And then this last column is the cost to raise $1. And it fluctuates a bit, of course, but ultimately we're looking at 20 cents, which again, is just a phenomenal number to continue to socialize with leadership on how to invest on why you invest in fundraising, especially when you're looking at kind of these huge healthcare systems where they're bringing in billions and billions of dollars. We really need to kind of make the argument as to why we need more investment in fundraising, and really the ROI and cost to raise $1 are really clear data points that get us there. Just to kind of hone in on this further, on the next slide, we have an example that we liked. If you take a look at kind of patient services costs, and if you just look at the bottom number, because it's easier, you have 990 million in the cost for your patients. Now, of course, that's your mission, is healthcare, so you need to spend that money. But then in terms of revenue, you're looking at, that gets you 1 billion in service revenue. So you've got your net return of 10 million. Now, a fundraising department that has a $2.3 million expenses cost can bring in something. This is something that happens in real life. So this is just an example. So it could bring in over $12 million, and you're looking at that $10 million of margin, but you needed to spend 2.3 to get there, as opposed to your 990 million. Now, I'm sure most of you are sort of like, well, these numbers are kind of atmospheric and we're so much smaller, but in reality, these same principles we find and apply to our arts and culture organizations, taking a look at what what it takes to run the gift shop and what your revenue expectations of that, things like your cafe, visitorship, all of these things, they have to be implemented because you're executing on your mission. But in terms of being able to quantify your ROI and your margin, always fundraising comes in as a phenomenal investment to do so. So now we're going to go to our last section, and I'm going to pass it back to Miriam, and then I'll close this out on showing you all some of the applications. of how we've applied a lot of this thinking and strategy for some of our client partners, and some of you may be on the call today, so thank you.
Thanks, Mary. So how can we leverage fundraising to empower our organizations to increase revenue and achieve our missions? In our experience, successful fundraising is really predicated on the strength of four key areas, if we just go to the next slide. So the case for support, defining our value proposition and providing donors with that inspiring rationale that really garners and mobilizes increased investment. Leadership, identifying and mobilizing our champions, not only the strength of our internal organization leadership, but also our volunteers. Who are our leaders who can really instill confidence in the community about the future vision of the organization? The prospective donor base, so really defining our potential universe of opportunity. Who has not only the capacity, but the affinity to be involved, and how can we access them? And then the plan, so determining the activities to pursue, the strategies to deploy, and the resource needs and structure, the staffing, the processes to really realize that opportunity. So by investing in a fundraising team and focusing on these four pillars, the nonprofit can really approach philanthropy more effectively. If we go to the next slide, just really these investments can help empower you to strengthen the ability to tell the story, to mobilize and support volunteer leaders in engaging others, to steward donors more effectively. We know that stewardship is really key, and we need to do that with real intentionality, as opposed to just when is the next time we're going to ask somebody for a gift. We really want to use that opportunity to deepen their engagement, and also embracing key strategies like gift planning to really expand philanthropic opportunity. So in looking at these kind of four pillars, we wanted to share a few case studies to really highlight some of this work in action and the return on investments in the team. So if we go to our first case study, how well you tell your story and making the connection between your museum's vision and the donor's interests can really have significant results. So we've partnered with the Carnegie Museums of Pittsburgh over the last several years. And for those who don't know, there are a group of 4 different types of museums, including the Carnegie Museum of Art, the Carnegie Museum of Natural History, the Andy Warhol Museum, and the Carnegie Science Center. And each of these 4 museums all have different goals, vision, and a plan, but also under one umbrella. And our dedicated work with each museum to articulate their individual case helped us to really build a strong overarching and visionary case that united all 4 of the institutions. So in this example, a customized proposal that really leveraged the core pillars of the case for support, specifically how the investment would transform the organization's spaces and programming, resulted in the largest gift in the museum's history. The $65 million campaign pledge ended up representing 72% of the overall $90 million goal for the Science Center. So while this is about a science center, the same idea can really be applied across all types of museums. Certainly to arts museums, collaboration across departments, for example, curatorial, education, et cetera, can really help to build stronger, compelling case elements and funding opportunities for donors. So really kind of blending the programmatic with the development approach can really yield some important results. Encouraging donors to underwrite exhibitions or visit the museums can really help appeal to donors in a strategic way and bring new audiences and donors into the circles. And oftentimes these sorts of collaborations really stem from the development team. If we go on to the next example, when NMAC was founded, CCS was engaged to help secure private support for this landmark effort. Our primary role was to leverage the power of the advisory council, the volunteer advisory council in fundraising, and really secure some significant high-level gifts from the leadership and those networks. So working in partnership with the organization, we really helped to mobilize leadership, engaging many of the country's leading corporate entities, philanthropists, and organizations to generate the significant funds needed to complete the museum's construction. While obviously NMAC is a large organization. All museums, large and small, benefit from engaging their leadership and board in fundraising efforts. Volunteer leaders can really be critical as ambassadors in opening doors for an organization and engaging prospects to invest in the vision for the future. And in some cases, solicit gifts, although we know that that comes with a significant amount of coaching. Barry, I'll turn it to you to talk about Brooklyn.
Great, thank you. So we mentioned the Brooklyn Museum a couple times on this call. They, the KP Trueblood, the COO, connected us to Remuseum, so we wanted to kind of talk about their work a little bit, and we'll talk through the lens of prospecting through Brooklyn Museum. So the museum had retained us about a little over a year ago, and the question that they were asking themselves is, what is our total philanthropic opportunity, and are we achieving it? And if not, how do we move ourselves kind of slowly into a structure and additional functions so that we do kind of move towards achieving what our total philanthropic opportunity presents? So I'll talk a little bit on the next slide, don't go yet, but I'll talk a little bit more about the data on the next slide. But here, fundamentally, we took a look at their total operation, the total development operation, but really focused on their individual giving. As Caroline had said earlier, individual giving for the last 20 years has been hovering around 70% of all philanthropic giving in the US. So we really look, and especially at Brooklyn, where it was situated, the board that it had, we knew that that was going to be where it was going to be the highest kind of initial ROI. So we did a data analysis, and fundamentally from there, and I'll explain what the data analysis is in a moment, but from there, we really took a lot of time in segmenting the pipelines. So as many of you may have, you have prospect lists, you have pipelines, they're sort of in some area of organization. They've been refreshed maybe over the last few years, but we really took the time to kind of cull people and really hone in on how many people each frontline fundraiser could have, especially the president of the museum, and put someone, a staff person, on a principal gifts pipeline entirely. So once we did that, you could see kind of the last point here on this slide is through the course of probably around 10 months, focusing on the principal gifts pipeline with the president of the museum, we were able to secure an additional, I think number is up even higher, so it might be 6 million plus general operating support throughout the year, just from these principal gifts. Now, these prospects were warm, they were mostly the board, so this is not taking someone cold and turning them into a 7-figure donor or high 6-figure donor, but these were asks that were very strategic and thoughtful, and we spent a lot of time kind of preparing for, proposals were written, and it was really tremendous success for the operating support of the museum for this year. So if we go to the next slide, just to talk you through a little bit of what I mean when I say data analytics, and some of you may be very familiar with this and others of you not. So, taking a database and running it through a wealth screen has been around for a long time. And that is, you take your donors and you have their home addresses. We put them through a database that kind of aggregates public information about them, their assets, their giving, and then it spits out a potential capacity range for what their philanthropic capacity could be overall. So we do that, but here at Brooklyn and at other institutions, we layer it with a predictive model. And that's where you really start honing in on your donors and what happens in your institution. And fundamentally, our analytics team creates a model for each institution that we work with and sort of takes a look at what are major and principal donors, what qualities and characteristics they have now, and how we apply those quality and characteristics through a data analysis to a very large data set so that we can funnel and prioritize. Prioritizing and being strategic with your time and your resources it sounds so simple, but to implement it really takes rigor and a lot of discipline. So we created that system at the highest level at the Brooklyn Museum, and you can just see kind of through this chart that we started on the right. If we started with a total constituency base of 100,000. If we came back and gave them 100,000 people to go out and solicit, it would just be totally overwhelming and not realistic. So it's a matter of how do we kind of cull that down into a list of the highest affinity and highest potential capacity prospects so that we can then focus our very lean resources. I'm saying lean for sort of everyone probably on this call in terms of what your fundraising goals are, and really kind of be very strategic and approach it from more of a sniper perspective, a sniper manner. So that was the Brooklyn Museum. I will talk a little bit also about the Portland Art Museum, which CCS has had a long, fruitful relationship with. The Portland Art Museum brought us on in 2019 to run a mid-campaign assessment. So they were in a very large campaign, the biggest they've ever had, over 100 million, and it was stalling. So we came in and we kind of did another data analysis. We worked with the board of trustees through a variety of different trainings. And then, of course, 2020 COVID hit and hit them incredibly hard, like it's hit a lot of us on this call incredibly hard. It seems very distant right now, but it was very real. And museums were closed. You saw that, like as Caroline mentioned before, that earned revenue chunk of the total revenue pie kind of became nothing. So it was, of course, incredibly hard for the Portland Art Museum. I think they were at about 50% of their total revenue was earned. But they took a bold and courageous move and kept us working even through a reduction of force. And they did not pause the campaign. And not only did they not pause the campaign, but they also took the moment to reassess their development team and reassess the functions. So we stayed on and we did kind of an overhaul of the development program in addition to working on the campaign, and it worked out. It worked out incredibly successfully for them. They are meeting and surpassing their annual fund goals, and they have raised over, I think it was 120 million of their campaign goal, which I think is the biggest in Oregon in the arts and culture sector. And even in 2022, kind of like, emerging from the pandemic, because they had never stopped, they ended up raising that year about $30 million in campaign revenue. So,
Barry, just a quick question here again from Crystal Bridges. What kind of staffing changes did they make, whether structural or otherwise?
yeah, so the staffing changes were fundamentally related to what we've been talking about in terms of managing a pipeline and how many people are in your pipeline, what is the goal that you're getting to. So they added frontline fundraisers, and they also added back office support as well.
And there's a follow-up question. I don't know that we'll be able to answer here. That would be interesting to see some examples of optimized departments, especially showing the back of house roles. So I'm guessing that, like I was, that there's a strong reaction to that 1-to-3 ratio and understanding what's the optimized 3. I think we all know what that 1 does, but kind of all of those. So maybe we can do a little follow-up on that, unless you have any thoughts now about that.
Sure, and fundamentally, it will be the functions that I had mentioned. So it's research, it's database entry, it's proposal writing, it's data analytics. So those are really the functions that you want your frontline fundraising professionals to be able to rely on the office for, so that they aren't sitting at their desk putting tons and tons of information into a database. They aren't sitting there doing hours and hours of prospect research. They're out there. But yes, I'm sure we can find kind of an anonymized staff chart and send that around as well.
Thanks.
Okay, so just to kind of wrap us up and kind of put a wrapper on everything we've been talking about. And something you can also, we wanted to create this so that you can also kind of sit down and reflect on where your institution is, or have a conversation with your executive director or your board chair or your fundraising chair, is where are we with these 3 pillars of what we know are incredibly important to overall programmatic fundraising success. So just to run through them briefly again, pace. out of these bullets underneath it, I like the one the best. It's like kind of what makes your museum unique. You know, we live in a very, as you all know, competitive philanthropic marketplace. So really being able to articulate why your institution exists, why it is singular, why it is important, and then of course connecting it to what's important to the potential donor. But that is something that I think, you know, what Miriam had talked about with the Carnegie Institutes, it really takes a lot of kind of consensus building and buy-in and thoughtful care to get to a place where everyone feels comfortable answering that question. And then the second one under case, I think is a really good one is, are you articulating to donors the impact of their gift? So that we do a lot of kind of planning, feasibility study interviews, and we hear that a lot, you know, we don't really know what it went to, especially if it's unrestricted. So making sure that you know, stewardship donor relations departments in arts and culture institutions tend to be very thin, if existent at all. So really understanding and planning out how you're going to respond and steward the gifts that you have, of course, we know is very important in just keeping your relationship with the potential donor, but also getting a next gift and keeping them involved in the organization. Leadership, I think we talked about. Prospects, I like this one. Do you know who's in your database? And in my mind, I say, do you really know who's in your database? Because a lot of folks, when we sit down with them, are like, oh, we know everybody. We don't need to, you know, we don't need to analyze our database. We have clear understanding of what's inside. And then when you start kind of kicking the tires around it, you know, maybe the chief development officer has a real understanding of the top 25, you know, 30 folks. But what we find the most kind of value add from going on into one of these projects is finding the people that you're not talking to and that you should be talking to. So that's always fun when you do kind of a data analytics project. And then do you have clear strategies for how to bring closer and steward your donors at every level? So this is really, I mean, we push this a lot and we kind of implement this a lot, but what is that 6-month, 12-month, 24-month plan for your top 100 donors? And then you could, once you have that, once you know kind of where you need to go with them, then it's a matter of, okay, so how does this look monthly? And everyone's under-resourced, overworked. It's really hard to take that time and sit down and look at a pipeline and decide what your kind of overall strategies are. But we find it to be incredibly helpful in realizing that those big gifts. And then finally, plan. So how do you set your annual fundraising goals? Does it come from the finance office because that's what's needed? Is it coming from a pipeline that's sort of rationalized and that your frontline fundraisers have thought through in terms of gift amount? It should be both. You know, of course, sometimes we see a lot of, well, the finance office told me I need to raise XX, so this is what my goal is. That's tricky for a fundraising team to live into if they haven't been part of the process. And when we talk about retention and support, these are the things that we hear a lot about in terms of why folks are unhappy or feel like they're not effective as they could be, is because they're not part of the process of creating their goals. And then what does your staffing plan look like? I mean, we've already talked about this. Do you have the right functions in place? Do you have the right people in those functions? Are they supported enough? Are they reaching their limits? Do they feel as though they can have a path forward? So all of those things are incredibly important to a fundraising office that is going to hum and that's going to move forward and kind of accomplish its goals. So I think that was our last formal slide that we wanted to walk you through.
Well, let me just jump right in because we've got some good follow-on questions. People have been paying attention. One specifically, you talked really in a great way about prospecting, and someone asked specifically, obviously there are wealth screening softwares out there, whether you had one to recommend or if you could maybe even give advice about how to go about selecting one.
I can jump in, Mary. So I would say that this kind of changes pretty fluidly as these companies kind of buy access to new data sets. I think the ones that we see most prevalently in use are Wealth Engine and iWave. I will say that, just a note about wealth screening is that it's really meant as a segmentation and directional tool. We know that it's not a fail-safe, and we also know that that's kind of the starting point for identifying an area of focus that then requires additional research and some of the people power to really dig into who these people are as individuals. We all know people with significant capacity who are not philanthropic, and we also know people who might not seem like they have a significant amount of capacity and end up being very strong, loyal supporters, whether that's through annual fund and then ultimately estate gifts, that sort of thing. So I think it's really meant as a segmentation tool to make sure that whatever frontline resources you have and whatever the structure is, that you're continuing to focus and see that return on the investment of where your focus area is.
Thank you. And another follow-up question was kind of somebody's really paying attention. So they noted that you pointed out the increasing return from longer tenures of fundraising staff, but then you said that Portland generated an almost a very short-term result from a restructuring. So can you talk a little bit about how those came together, how they generated a bit benefit without having to wait so long?
Sure. So, and Brooklyn too. So I think there's the organization and structuring of sort of what we would consider the low-hanging fruit. So there's money that can be brought in by focus and strategy. And then you're talking about, I think the Chronicle of Philanthropy stat is more of building a more broader base, consistent, taking on new fundraisers that are having new pipelines and finding people at different levels. So it's both and, but yes, I think that's the distinction, is when you bring on someone new to kind of a newer area. What we did both at Pam and Brooklyn was, like I said, these folks were known. So this was we needed to create a system and develop a case and then be really rigorous in terms of reaching out. But at the same time, there will also be an additional fundraising folks coming on that will for sure take longer to build out their pipelines and to create a relationship.
A real takeaway for me here is I think the probably chronic underinvestment in both front and back office, and the front relationships take time, but you can scale up some of the support service faster. We have a great question about something I know you all are prepared to talk about, is how does the great wealth transfer and a moment of money switching hands across generations impact how we should be thinking about fundraising?
Sure. We see, especially in arts and culture sector, a really under-resourced planned giving function. I know, Caroline and I have been working with the Perez Art Museum in Miami on a $100 million endowment campaign, and I will tell you that we are really seeing a lot of folks putting half or portions of their campaign gifts into planned gifts, which we're happy to take, and it suits our needs, and every institution kind of has to decide what they're looking for. But we can see already the impact of even opening up a conversation as an ask. Let's say it's $5 million, 2.5 would be cash, and then 2.5 would be a planned gift. So there's a lot of focus on that in pretty much everything that we do. And when we're at our arts or culture institutions, there's very little typically kind of broad, your broad-based planned giving function, where you're just kind of bringing people into a legacy society and you're touching people that are giving at low levels at this moment. So it's really kind of a two-pronged approach. It's including it in your major and principal gifts, and then it's understanding how to really hire a staff person focused on this, typically, if not more than one, and start building out a kind of longer, more mass market planned giving program.
I think the other piece of this is considering multi-generational engagement, right? So thinking about how to involve the next generation of families in a museum's activities, particularly for those who have had long-term commitments to an organization. Now, that possibly runs into some challenges because this next generation might have different areas of interest. And so, again, I think really understanding what those interests are for wanting to create that legacy or to create that impact, what that looks like at a museum, and really thinking about how that intersects with the museum's goals and what the organization wants to achieve. Can you line those up? But I think the biggest part of it is starting that conversation. And I think having a conversation about planned gift intentions can be intimidating to some folks, but I think we're leaving a lot of money on the table to not have those conversations, and it's in the best interest of the institution. The other thing I would say is with some of this shift for organizations looking at growing endowment funding specifically versus capital projects, I think that lends itself very well to having the conversation about planned gifts. And I know that the last couple of years especially had a lot of individual philanthropists thinking differently about their intentions and revisiting some of their plans to the real benefit of these institutions.
I just collapsed there because such a good point you made. Otherwise, a good question that you shared, the CTRD numbers, which is cost to raise $1, or the multiples for healthcare, which you showed, we're generating 5 times the cost. Do you have numbers on the arts and culture sector to compare?
We don't. We were researching this before because I asked the same question. We haven't found one that is recent enough to be relevant. So unfortunately, we don't have like an exact number for you at the moment.
I mean, I have seen numbers that show that, optimized they're at least that high, kind of in arts and culture. So I think there's no reason to think they aren't. And I guess that's what here's Rod sharing some information that Crystal Bridges, if the average is 4x, is that the best indicator? They look at a 3-year full rolling average. I guess the big point I would make here is whatever the number, this is to come back to my introduction, there is no investment that there's almost no investment a museum can make that will generate the kind of returns for its mission that this kind of investment will generate, right? Earned income, you compared it to healthcare. I just want to reiterate that point. There is no retail operation, cafe, facility rental business at any museum in the country that is generating crazily a 50% over the investment, right? No one is doing 2x. You're talking about something that could be 3x, 4x, 5x. Why do museums consistently underinvest in the surest way to generate return? And I think this reluctance comes from both boards and the people who are putting the budgets together. Why is that? And I know we're almost at time, so I'm giving you a really big question right at the end.
I think there's a little bit of if you're investing in the organization, it should go directly towards the mission, towards the programs and what the museum is delivering. And so I think there's a little bit of by contrast, our university partners, if they're doing a large scale campaign, they will hire hundreds of new gift officers because as long as they're raising, $1 more than what it cost, right? They're reaching more alumni and that sort of thing. And in many ways, the museum work is harder because we don't have a natural constituency, right? We have to attract new audiences and then move them up the pipeline. So I think it has something to do with maybe us telling a better story of connecting, investing in the fundraising is going to help the investment in the mission because it generates more resources and can go to programs and that sort of thing. But I think that's maybe the biggest hurdle. It's coming from a mindset of scarcity.
A very smart museum director said to me that that they were having to choose between investing in fundraising or investing in education programming. And I thought, this doesn't make sense to me because I would invest in the fundraising to generate lots of money that you can pour into your education programming. And I think boards, many of whom come from successful businesses where they would pile on salespeople if they had a chance to generate new revenue, have a hard time, supporting the same thing in the museum. And I think the same thing with planned giving. So anyway, I hope this will encourage. I know you've shown a lot of people how to do it, and I want to thank Barry and Miriam and Caroline and CCS Fundraising for walking us through these steps. I'm super bullish on museums. It's a tough moment, I think they have the missions to generate the support they need in the future. And there's a science of how to generate the biggest chunk of the revenue to fund those missions. And I think you've shown them how to do the work. I know you're available for follow-up if they're interested in talking to you. We'll make this recording available. And thank everybody who joined us from all across the world of American museums today. Have a good
Thank you
afternoon.
so
Thank you so
much.
much.
Rest of your
Thanks,
day.
everyone.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.